We now segue into our first panel discussion, in which we will hear about the main drivers behind the EU Cloud COC, the challenges it has taken to get where we are today, and hopefully we'll also be able to get a better understanding of the long trajectory that has led to the adoption of the code. For this cause, we are very pleased indeed to still have with us David Stevens, Chairman of the Belgian Data Protection Authority, who is also joined today by Dr. Oliver Draf, Chief Privacy Officer at Volkswagen, Helmut Fahlmann, co-CEO and co-founder at Fabersoft, Jonathan Sage, EU lead at IBM Government and Regulatory Affairs and chair of the EU Cloud COC General Assembly, Joern Whitman, Managing Director of Scope Europe, and Michal Paprowski, CTO at Euroclear. As always, you can get involved with today's conversation by posing your own questions to the panel using the Q&A functionality on the platform, and we shall pick them up towards the end of the discussion. So perhaps we could jump straight into things here, and I'd first like to turn to David, if he is still online with us at the moment, in order to get the perspective of the Belgian DPA on the new code. And of course, David, I mean, in your opinion, what are the key elements here from your point of view that has allowed the EU Cloud COC to reach this unique status? And what do you perceive its impact to be on the EU regulatory environment? And perhaps you can also talk a bit more about your collaboration with other EU DPAs as part of the project.
Yes, thank you. What I think that are key elements in why it finally happened is, I would say, the situation of mutual trust or respect. And this is not irrelevant, particularly for our authority. Until 2 years ago, we were a purely advisory commission. We gave advices on legislation and regulation, but we were not really capable of imposing sanctions, doing in-depth investigations, and so on and so on. So we were, I would say, at a quite big distance of industry. And I would say, I think that one of the reasons why because I really consider it a joint effort of us and Scope Europe, and of course all the European colleagues, in one of the reasons why it finally happened, I think, is not only because the circumstances, external circumstances changed. Cloud is no longer an exotic technology which we don't know about. It's actually quite mature and quite stable, so we know what we're talking about now. From a technological point of view, I think as a data protection authority, we in the last 2 years also really learned a lot on how technology and industry is working. That was less of a concern when we just gave advices on the legislation. And I think, well, I heard this morning that it's apparently an exercise of about a decade. So I think your perseverance, or the perseverance of EU Cloud and the General Assembly, has been very important. We had some moments where there was, I would almost say, more from the side of Scope Europe, I think, almost like despair of when will it happen. We always said, well, keep in mind that we're working, it's not, you don't necessarily need to convince us. We also need to convince the 26 other colleagues in Europe. So it has been a very complex exercise. And well, people that have been working at the European, and this is not a critique, but at the European scene, well, we all know how difficult it is already to work with three or closely work with 3, 4, 5, 10 people. But if you work together and need to find the consensus between 26 different regulators with each their tradition, each their culture, each their legal background and legal system and habits, this is not trivial. And again, for our authority, seeing where we come from, being a purely advisory committee 2 years ago, 3 years ago, pushing now in my view, short time, a code of conduct with industrial partners, in a relationship of mutual trust, is really a big achievement. That's also why I'm so proud. So I think one of the reasons is perseverance from the side of Cloud Europe, of Scope Europe, sorry, and the change which our authority has gone through the last 2 or 3 years. The impact, I tried to say it already in my keynote this morning. I think the impact, well, I'm sure the impact is that this code is not only a good code. I gave the arguments why I believe so, but it's also a starting point. I think this is the first one. It's not the last one. We're celebrating the first transnational code. This is not final. This is probably also not the perfect or the ideal code. Like in life, most of the things are never perfect or ideal. So for me, the impact is it's a starting point, not only for this code to develop and to further evolve, maybe in the area of international transfers, but it's also an example for every big and small company or controller of personal data in Europe. It's also an example of what a code can be, what type of deal, I would say, you can make with a supervisory authority. And that is the main impact. I think it's a best practice and a starting point for me. And from the point of view, and then I'll conclude, from the point of view of the Belgian authority, this is also for us a starting point. We are absolutely eager to publish this code and to be able to spread it to the world and say this is, and share it as a good example. Again, not an ideal example. The future will bring changes probably, and maybe there will be problems on the way, but let's solve it, and let's solve it in a situation with mutual respect, like we now the last two years or 10 years, but pushed it over the limit together.
Okay, thank you, David. You referenced the perseverance from Scope Europe in particular in helping us get to where we are today. And I just wonder, Johan, if we could probe Scope Europe's position in the code a bit more further here. Obviously, Scope Europe has been tasked with being the first accredited monitoring body for a GDPR COC. Can you explain to us, Johan, how this actually works in practice, how this monitoring mechanism functions as part of the agreement, and how it also compares to alternative instruments?
Happy to do so. Maybe just a quick add to what David just said on the level of sometimes despair. I think that's how you said it, David. I would like to point out, yes, I mean, we all wish that sometimes things go faster, but we should not underestimate the fact that here, and I would like to underline what David also said, is that 27 member states with different cultures and backgrounds came together and made a unanimous decision yesterday on such a complex topic, again, across all service layers, with future-proof elements to cover Kubernetes container solutions and so forth. So this is something that is maybe not happening all the time in the European Union, that a full agreement of 27 member states happens. And I would like to say that this is a great achievement, and it was worth waiting for that. So that's my first point. And also maybe I would like to highlight not only David's authority that did a fantastic job, and where I can only give the compliment back regarding the mutual trust. I would also highlight the process within the EDPB, which was definitely improving the code. So just to make that very clear, special thanks go here, for example, to CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, or the Irish one that contributed significantly during the co-review phase of this code. And then at the end of the day, to all 27 that provided comments to the code and improved it. So I would like to, before I go to the question, I would like to highlight that and would like to point out that achievement. So now to come to your question, the role of Scope Europe. So Scope Europe is an association, a company that was established specifically against the background of GDPR. So we knew there's a new tool, there's a code of conduct, and it comes along with something new called the monitoring body, with very, very strict requirements regarding its independence and so forth. So from the very first moment, we're working in this field for a longer time with our German parent company. But from the very first moment, we knew we have to design something from scratch that meets the requirements. And for that purpose, for example, we sat together later, maybe he can say a little bit more about it himself, with Peter Schaar, the former German Federal Data Protection Commissioner, and designed the concept for Scope Europe, how to meet the requirements of Article 41, so the monitoring body. But we did also more. We also wanted to be Scope Europe, a place where you can come to and draft codes of conduct, where you can host codes of conduct, and so forth. And now we come to the point, what is this monitoring? Because, for example, in the morning I read a very good article, but also raising the question, how can a monitoring be really independent if it's actually financed by the ones that it's checking? So that is the part where I think we almost worked as hard on, David, as we did on the code of conduct, is the independence and the freedom of decision-making of the monitoring body. GDPR is very strict here, but the specific implementation has to be checked by the Data Protection Authority. So we worked really hard together and designed a concept that makes clear that any kind of decision, any kind of assessment cannot be influenced by the companies that are being involved in the process. And by that, we also designed the whole monitoring process, which from my perspective is really unique. And I would like to say thank you to the General Assembly and all the members of the code that from the very beginning incorporated the idea of a monitoring body into the code of conduct. It was made sure that every single provision of that code can actually be assessed by a third independent party. And that is something unique, because before, usually a code was written and later it was checked if it can actually be monitored or not. So this was always, so to say, I call it, so to say, monitoring by design, was tailored in that code. And I would also like to highlight that with the system we developed, we didn't only want to meet the requirements of Article 41 or Article 40. We went with the monitoring system beyond. And that is something very special to this membership and to this group, where the decision was made not only to meet the legal requirements, but say, okay, let's achieve the level of trust we envision for the cloud market to really activate the cloud market. So I'll give you an example. This is the only code, also amongst the others that are not approved yet that I've seen, that initially assesses every single service that's being declared. So it's really completely checked. Once you declare adherence, a customer, cloud user can rely on the fact that the monitoring body looked at it. Sorry for the background noise. We also incorporated a solution to make sure that everything is, sorry for the background, that the processing that usually happens in the background at the cloud provider is ensured that it can become transparent. So we incorporated, for example, a whistleblowing mechanism that is pretty unique and not required by GDPR, which is very unique, and so forth. We have annual rechecks and all of that. So against that background, I close my question and stop you from being annoyed by my background noise. Sorry for that.
Thanks for your response there, Johan. I just wanted to follow up on one point there that you made, Johan, on the whistleblowing mechanism as part of the code. Perhaps you could give us a bit of a breakdown into how this would function in practice.
Yeah, great. But first of all, Sam, your voice obviously calmed my dog, so thank you for that. Secondly, yes. So, I mean, GDPR requires that there must be a complaints mechanism in the code of conduct that is make sure that someone who thinks that there's infringement of the code, not only the monitoring body spots something, but someone outside can report. But usually that's designed in a way that, you know, the person that providing this or files the complaint must provide its own name and so forth. We thought that since the normal cloud user cannot really spot possible infringements, we wanted to add an additional layer of safety. And we said, okay, very often it's possibly employees maybe of the cloud providers that might spot something like that. And in order to prevent, or better to enable them to really file that complaint, we created a system that really makes sure this complaint is completely anonymous and can be followed up by the monitoring body.
Okay, thanks for the information there, Johan. And your earlier points on independence and freedom of decision making, I believe, is something that we may have time to come back to later on as part of our panel discussion. And perhaps we can look into how we can preserve that independence as the code evolves over time. Jonathan Sage, IBM now. Jonathan, you're chair of the EU Cloud COC General Assembly, and you've obviously contributed to the development of the code from very early on. I wonder if you can give us an overview of this trajectory and highlight what are the certain elements of this code in particular that maybe set it apart from other codes and other agreements? Obviously, we heard from Pierce O'Donoghue earlier that there is another code that has recently been approved as well.
Thank you, Sam. Quite a lot has been said already about the long history, but I'll briefly be more specific. I mean, it was great to hear from Neelie Kroes and her 2012 cloud strategy, which is the starting point really for the code. And she mentioned under the cloud strategy, she set up various select industry groups, and one was set up to develop a code of conduct. And that's actually from the Unleashing the Potential of Cloud Computing paper, which was published by the Commission in 2012. So obviously that's the starting point. There was a actual meeting started to happen, hosted in Beaulieu in Brussels. And I remember at that time, there were about 50, quite a wide community involved of about 50 stakeholders. And at one point, there were so many meetings taking place, we almost said, is it worth going home? Let's put up a tent outside Avenue de Beaulieu, because we were permanently in the Commission discussing these select industry groups. But moving forward, of course, there was the implementation of a code under the Data Protection Directive. So we actually developed the instrument and launched it before full implementation of GDPR. So 2016 was the date, I think it was April 2016, adoption of GDPR. We launched the code in 2017. 2018 was implementation of GDPR. And that's when, of course, we started fine-tuning the code to meet GDPR requirements. So, you know, that's the community varied from as large as 50 down to a core group of less than 10. We're now back up to a much larger community that we've heard from earlier this morning. I think in terms of what this code does, when we started, there was more attention perhaps to the infrastructure, public infrastructure layer, and GDPR brought with it more responsibilities for the controller as well as the processor. That's baked in GDPR. And I think we all believe that under the code, we're not only addressing the importance of infrastructure, but the increasing prominence of software delivered via the cloud, which is SaaS. And I think it's crucial that we've built into the code this idea of dual responsibility between the controller and the processor. And that's why we've seen leading SaaS providers, large and small, join us in the code. So I think that's one of the differentiating points for us. And then we look forward, of course, to hearing from the users that are amongst us today, like the EU Cloud User Coalition with Euroclear, Volkswagen, because ultimately it's the users that benefit from having such a compliance mechanism.
Thanks, Jonathan, for your comments there. And perhaps this is a good time to bring in Michał Paprocki from Euroclear. Michał, perhaps you could give us a breakdown of the overarching challenges imposed by GDPR for cloud service users and how the code will function in helping users to get over some of these challenges.
Okay, thank you. And indeed, we are in quite a good momentum because there's a bit of nexus of the forces. So on one hand, cloud is maturing, so we have more and better, more resilient technology coming from the main vendors. At the same time, companies are onboarding cloud more aggressively than before. I believe we already have some good experience from the past and we are on the way to accelerate. And there's a more intensive dialogue with the regulators. So in case of Euroclear, we are dealing, of course, with NBB, so the regulator in Belgium, but also discussing with Banque de France, Bank of England. So code of conduct helps quite tremendously in the sense that it helps us to set the level playing field and also reduce the frictions of discussing many countries with many regulators. So it helps us to set the common denominator. And you mentioned also European Cloud User Coalition, because indeed I'm quite active in the cloud sphere. So that was a bottom-up initiative of let's agree on some market standards which were more tackling risk management and security rather than compliance. But I believe we need these layers of sometimes self-defined standards to also make sure that we could align with the regulations going forward. So GDPR, it's a big one for us, but equally so, if you look at last September and the DORA, that's also a major piece of regulation that we need to align to. And then there's a big one on data management. There's a big one on how do we treat outsourcing providers. So practically, we are participating as the private sector together with some of our peers, so with Commerzbank, with Volkswagen, with ING, on trying to set up the regulations and the standards so that we could speak with one voice towards the cloud service providers. It also helps us to increase our bargaining power because we are fragmented and the cloud providers are big. So if we align and join forces, I believe it would be easier to come up with a consistent offering aimed at the financial sector that is highly regulated. And at the same time, so the second level is the regulators themselves. So it helps us also to have a more structured dialogue to see how do we control risk and how do we ensure compliance, the same way as we would do for our on-prem implementations. How do we guarantee the same level of compliance and security in the cloud sphere? So again, I believe that that's useful. So two angles. So first one towards the cloud service providers, to actually define what do we want as the financial sector so that we are still in control, adherent to all the regulations, and towards the regulators to reduce the frictions because there are slightly different flavors within EU. So I also welcome the fact that we are standardizing on the regulators, on the regulations, but if you look at data protection policy in Finland, then it's actually a totally different ballgame than what we would do in the UK or in Belgium. So it's not yet fully synchronized.
Okay, thank you, Mikhail, for your points there. And you did gesture towards the compliance levels as part of the code. And for this cause, I'd like to bring in Helmut Fahlmann from Fabersoft here. So Helmut, knowing Fabersoft has successfully declared its services adherent to the code at the highest compliance level, maybe you could tell us a bit about how the code has impacted your own compliance exercises and internal dynamics. But firstly, perhaps you could talk about these different levels of compliance in general for us first.
Yes, hello, good morning. Fabersoft has focused on trusting cloud services since we started our cloud business unit in our company group. We always strive for the highest compliance levels because we think that external audits really bring in better quality of compliance for cloud services. So we are, for example, we're listed on Frankfurt Stock Exchange to be fully transparent, and we continuously show our compliance and governance. Regarding the Fabersoft Cloud services specifically, we have built one internal controls catalog for information security, for data protection, and for service level management right from the start. Then we map the controls of our internal controls catalog to the individual controls, to the individual audits and certifications. Almost all of the controls that the EU Cloud Code of Conduct requires had already been covered by our BSI C5 implementation and audit. Our cloud service agreement covers all the legal requirements of the code and has been audited by the auditors as well. So we usually mandate either PwC or EY or KPMG as our auditors, and that is what defines the level 3 of the EU Cloud of Conduct. The level 1 is the one where you basically declare your compliance yourself without any external auditing, and which is the, if you want, the weakest level of showing compliance. And as I said before, my personal belief is that the best way to get trust in cloud services, especially in the SME sector, is to use external auditors.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Helmut, there for your clarifications on the compliance levels.
May I quickly just jump in here, if you allow me?
Please,
Just a clarification. What Helmut says, of course, absolutely correct. Just to make sure, also on every level of compliance, there must be always full compliance with the code, and the full compliance is always verified by the monitoring body. What Helmut was speaking about, an additional layer of third-party auditors. So, like to say, a double pack of checking. But the monitoring body is always there. And so every process is designed that also on level 1, on level 2, and on every level, the service is being declared adherent to the code of conduct. The monitoring body must be provided with evidence that the compliance is really the case, just to make sure there's a clear understanding in this regard. Thank you.
Thanks, Johan. And I imagine you would encourage as many members as possible to go for that highest level of compliance as part of the code.
Actually, I wouldn't. I think it really depends on the business model. I think there's absolutely for maybe even the most, and that's why we designed it, that there's something for all market players there, a sufficient level of compliance and proof given. The question is now only more in the direction of how strong you want to prove certain things of what you do to your users. And you can go always beyond, but I can already tell you, and I think maybe David will agree with me here, level 1 is fully in line, and from my perspective with the whistleblowing I just described and everything, goes already beyond what is required. And then we even added on top of that even more, because we knew, for example, we see here Mr. Babrotsky, Oliver Draf, we knew there are players on the market that require more, sometimes not even only coming from GDPR, but also other legislating acts that impact them.
Okay, thanks very much, Johan. David, did you want to jump in on that point there?
Absolutely, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to very shortly say, I think one of the pitfalls of this kind of instrument, there are two easy pitfalls. There is one, this is not a blanco check. Such code of conduct should not, have as a result that there is actually no control. This is the one side. But on the other side, I think there is also a risk of over formalizing things. And I do agree with Jorn to say there is no use to say to let's say a startup, small or medium enterprise with some kind of innovative cloud product or service. There's no use, they don't understand GDPR, but there's no use in saying, okay, we see you don't understand GDPR, but have an external auditor and everything will be fine. So the issue, we're looking for balance here. We shouldn't under formalize, we shouldn't over formalize, it should be in balance. And for some, the monitoring body will be sufficient, level 1 will be sufficient. And of course, if you're a bigger player and have a higher risk and more data and sensitive data, then additional formalization can be necessary. But I think it's an issue of balance, and there are two clear pitfalls which we, I think, need to avoid.
Okay, thank you, David. There,
Sam, I'd just like to, if I can,
Jonathan,
just augment, in the spirit of an interactive discussion, one of the key points when we design the code is to make it accessible to smaller players, and we felt that we heard from Secure App Box and others that going for a fully fledged ISO 27000 SOC 2 certification for a smaller player is just not feasible, and this is the beginning of their journey. Now, as David says, this is all about risk, and a risk-based approach means the higher the risk. For instance, financial services, the bigger requirements. So we actually mapped all the principles and requirements of the code against schemes such as ISO 27001, SOC 2, C5, EU Cloud Code of Conduct being at the heart of that. And this is crucial to enable players to demonstrate compliance at different risk levels.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks very much for your comments there, Jonathan. And of course, with a reference here to different market players, someone we have on this panel is Oliver Draf from Volkswagen. And I wonder, Oliver, if you could give us the perspective of the automotive industry here, and how do you believe co-regulatory initiatives such as the EU Cloud COC can be of use to the automotive sector in general? I believe you're on mute, Oliver. There we go. That's better.
That's better. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Sam, for that very pertinent question. We believe that this approach is very valuable to us because the co-regulation provides us with the security that we've been missing so far. We need that worthy data protection supervisory authority engagement to have assurance that our investment, our massive investment in this technology is not badly spent. So thank you very much, David, for your interaction, for leading this foray and leading those very difficult discussions. I'm quite aware of the feat that you've accomplished here. Thank you very much from my side. Now, I believe, like you, that this is only the start, because we've got so much more challenges to tackle in this GDPR environment that I'm thinking of. For example, data anonymization would be on the plate. And there's so much we can achieve in this co-regulatory approach. So that I think, Sam, you're totally right. This is very well done, very well executed. And I think under Gaia, we are continuing this road in the direction of setting up data spaces to have European citizens profit from the data wealth that we generate.
Okay, thank you, Oliver, there. And you referenced GaiaX, and perhaps something we can speak about a bit more later on. Just a quick reminder for all of you watching at home to send your questions through to us using the Q&A functionality on the platform. I'm being told that we're getting a few in so far, so we'll turn to those towards the end of the panel. Jorn, I'd like to turn back to you, and I suppose beyond the cloud industry and the privacy community themselves, how do you believe that the EU Cloud COC will impact the development of further co-regulatory initiatives across other sectors, such as the automotive industry, for example, and policy fields, both at the national and at the EU level? And are there any pressing issues at the current time that you believe the EU Cloud COC could help solve them? And that's a question for Johan.
Yes, thank you. So I think when you look at the legislative environment in Europe, and that's also something that Piers O'Donoghue mentioned, is that you spot more and more reference to codes of conduct in every new regulation on the European level. Still, there was a proof of concept missing yet. So I think this is kind of, and it was said now many times, kind of a starting point to spread also in other regulatory environments where it's simply not possible to create a future-proof regulation on a technical detailed level. So that's why I think it's a clear sign, and also what David mentioned, with the right spirit and also the lessons learned from these kind of initiatives to now spread all over an innovation-friendly policy environment, but yes, also very protective consumer and data protection and so forth environment in Europe. So that is the first point. The second point, of course, is within GDPR. Oliver Draf has mentioned one subject, which is anonymization, which is a really important one. Others I can easily imagine in the health and the finance sector, of course. But I think if you talk about the most pressing issue, of course, there's what came out last year is the Schrems II ruling, and something where we can work on. And as we know, and maybe David can add to that idea, as we all know, the tools that were being used in the past for third country data transfers, but we also learned with GDPR that there are new tools available to do that. And one of those is a code of conduct specifically designed for third country data transfers. And one might think, okay, this is just another tool. It just adds something to the environment. But I'm convinced that it's actually more than that. First of all, we can design something specifically tailor-made to the cloud industry, which gives a higher level of specification to the controller to understand what actually are the supplementary measures to make sure that the data also in the third country are protected. And the second thing is, and that's of course something that connects me to my first intervention, is the monitoring body. There is already an independent player in place. Why not use that player to solve pressing issues of the Schrems II ruling? So for example, the Schrems II ruling puts strong obligations on the data controllers when choosing a cloud provider, saying, okay, you have to check also the legislative environment in a third country, which, and coming back to the SMEs, also to the larger players, but especially the SMEs, is basically impossible. So we are thinking of a solution, and we are working on it actually right now already, also together with the colleagues from the Belgian authority, is a solution where you utilize this independent system in the middle and don't put the obligations of the controller simply on the processor, which would not work. You know, the data that's flowing is simply not in that way possible to monitor and to understand from a cloud provider. And use this tool in the middle, the monitoring body, to take this obligation of the controller, and by that add to the market, add to cloud adoption, and add to the safety that's provided for third country data transfers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Johan, there. Jonathan, I wanted to bring you in here to talk a bit more about the potential spillovers of the achievements, if you like, of the code in the future with other European policy dossiers. If we think about the Data Governance Act or the Data Act or the Digital Services Act, for example, as well as other initiatives in the European cloud space like Gaia-X. So what sort of an impact or influence can that code have in this environment? Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That's a great question, and one that's consuming a lot of discussion at all levels, I think. My view is that this was already mentioned by Piers earlier, and I think he's entirely right. One level is that this is a sort of proof of value of a code of conduct, and this instrument will be used more widely. But secondly, codes of conduct such as ours will play directly into the cloud rulebook. So if you look at, for instance, Gaia-X and their policy rules document, to be compliant with Gaia-X in the future, cloud providers will have to attest to their levels of data protection, data portability, and security. So I think that this code will be one of the de facto requirements in order to prove compliance with Gaia-X, and by extension, that would be what is expected from in the cloud rulebook, and indeed also from other users, that if you don't have a code of conduct for data protection, you'll attract a lot of attention of perhaps not being negligent in your due diligence. I think it's going to become a wider requirement at EU level, but also, GDPR is a global tool, so it has global reach.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jonathan. And David, I wonder if you agree there with Jonathan's comments on the perhaps broader application of the Code of Conduct in the context of other regulatory initiatives at the EU level. And also just tagging on to what Jörn was mentioning earlier with regards to the data protection landscape in a post-Schrems II world. Do you envisage any other challenges going forward in terms of your work with other EU DPAs? As both the cloud landscape evolves over time, along with the code itself? David.
Yes, thank you. The answer is nuanced. Let me start with the broadening of the scope of this code of conduct, or adding on additional modules. I think there it's a full yes. I think that makes sense. It probably even makes sense to do it for international transfers, specifically for the cloud context. So absolutely, I think that the code, as I said, could be a best practice, an example, and can be leveraged towards other topics, other sectors, other players, and so on and so on. Where I tend to more disagree is with respect to is a code of conduct. I mean, a code of conduct can be an instrument in trying to solve the international transfer problem. I'll summarize it as that. We know it's a complex problem for a specific sector, but I don't think that it's and if it takes too much time for a more, I would say, global solution, global in the sense of overarching different sectors, it might make sense to do it in a code of conduct. But I don't envisage adopting codes of conduct on international transfers in 10 different sectors, and then that 10 different codes which would try to deal for each sector separately with the international transfer problem. I do think the international transfer issue, problem, case needs to be solved in a harmonized European and at the highest level possible. We need one solution, and one solution which would be similar not only for different sectors but also for different countries inside of the European Union. So in a way, I would say I tend to disagree that multiple codes, a code of conduct in a specific sector, and it could be cloud, can be a solution, but I don't think a multitude of codes of conduct will solve the international transfers problem. We need a much more harmonized and a single European solution for that. And we need to speak it with one voice in this debate, because if it will be with 10 different sectors and 10 different or 27 different countries, it will be even worse, I fear. So.
Okay, thanks, David. We're getting a couple of nodding heads there from our panel. I wonder if anyone wanted to jump in after David's comments there. Oliver, Oliver or Jonathan, perhaps? Yes, Oliver.
Yes, now, thank you very much for muting. Absolutely, David. And as you know, we in Germany, we have 17 data protection supervisory authorities. We suffer badly from this respect. I'd be interested to learn from you, David, if you think the new Biden administration is going to reach out with their hand to solve the fringe issue, because I'm kind of hopeful that something might happen. David.
Okay, David, it's feel free to take this one by the horns and give it your best.
Well, I have no clue of what the Biden administration precisely is aiming at. So, but I mean, as a head of one of the 27 data protection authorities, I can only say, and it helps, of course, I guess, being small in the European context as Belgium and as Belgian regulator, I really believe we need a harmonized European view, vision, standpoint, and act accordingly. So. Let me try to respond. I don't think the Belgian authority or the Belgian authority together with Scope Europe will solve the issue. Those were negotiations between United States administration at the one hand and the European Commission speaking for all of us at the other hand. For me, those are the two main parties that need to find the solution to this problem. And as Europe, we do need to defend our position that our GDPR aims to create a safe zone. I will not call it a safe harbor, but a safe zone. It might be inspiring for the negotiators, but a safe zone of data protection. And we cannot accept that data is, to use one of the data processing terms, leaking constantly, not in the US, but also not in China, and also not in other countries. And this is, I think, essential for coming to a compromise, which will finally be accepted by the European Court, because I do acknowledge that the European Court, in a way, has put additional burden on the shoulders of many controllers, saying whatever the Commission negotiated with America is not appropriate, and now controllers need to find out whether legislation in India or in China or whatever other country is appropriately protecting the privacy of our citizens. It's not really a solution. Again, a code of conduct in a specific sector might be an instrument that brings some remediation, I guess, but in the end, we will need to come to a compromise, a situation between the United States and Europe as a whole, for all sectors and for all countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, David, for your comments there. Jonathan,
yes. I completely agree with David on this. We don't want a proliferation of multiple codes of conduct. That will cause confusion for the users. So I think there'll be this is a fundamental horizontal code for the cloud industry. What I do expect is based on risk that specific additional requirements or modules could be added to this. For instance, perhaps in the health sector, financial services, where higher requirements are necessary, and a module, an extension of this code could then provide sector-specific requirements in line with regulatory initiatives such as the NIS directive, and as was mentioned, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, DORA, which will require similar sort of proof of compliance. So that's the way I would see it developing, rather than multiple proliferation of codes, which, as we've seen, take time. So, can the industry afford to work in parallel on successions of these codes? Probably by industry sector, no. We want to build on what we've got.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Jonathan. And I just wanted to pick up on that point about adding additional modules to the code as the data protection landscape evolves over time. Is this something that you see happening in practice, Johan? And I mean, maybe you could give us a bit of a timeline for the data transfer module that you're currently working on.
Yeah, so it's something I already got into a little bit earlier. So I think, and that's also something that David mentioned, the additional modules I think are relevant, because this whole code was designed to meet the user perspective. Meaning that is the reason why we took the challenge, while many told us it might be too complicated or complex, to go for all cloud offerings, for all service layers. We decided a user, even the larger ones, it's so hard, even for us, after working on that topic for such a long time, it's so hard to distinguish sometimes the service layers in the cloud. So we didn't want the user to understand, is that kind of the service and that part of the service now in line with GDPR, and the other maybe not? For what do I have proof of compliance, and for what not? So this is where we're aiming for. That was the first step. So this user-centric perspective, so to say. Now we want to move on with that, because we're very much aware, and that's also something I mentioned already, is that there comes something on top, or maybe not on top, because everyone has to be the same way compliant with GDPR, but a sector that needs something more specific. DORA was mentioned here, maybe something comes from that. I think Michael maybe can add to that. In the health sector, very specific environments that also need a solution to tick the box, because what we want to achieve is that they can now simply tick the box. And that is, the list is maybe a little bit longer in automotive and finance or in health, what needs to be ticked, than on the global scale. So we were always aiming for creating a compliance environment in this regard. And that's what we're doing. So what I can tell you, we're already working, you asked for a timeline, we're working on the solution for the third country data transfer as well. But right now, of course, every cloud provider that is compliant with the code must meet all requirements related to third country data transfer. Not that this is confused, but of course we know that there are challenges ahead. We're working on that. I'm actually, if I may disagree with some speakers here on the panel, I'm slightly more optimistic that we actually can achieve something quite big here. Also given the history that we were told already once that it's basically impossible to create such a solution for the whole cloud industry. So we did. So I'm a little bit more optimistic, especially given the fact that you now see already some court decisions coming up that actually show certain supplementary measures are sufficient to address certain issues. We learn from that. Of course, we're waiting for the data protection authorities to also give us guidance here, but I think it's possible. And the timeline, that is really hard to estimate. Actually, the core work, from my perspective, is not even close to be as complex and hard as it was with the core code. The topics are much broader in the core code, but the guidance from the law is even much less than for the base code for the third country data transfers, which means this is a negotiation. This is something where we had to sit with ideas, smart ideas, and with a mutual respect that David mentioned, on one table with the authorities and discuss what can be a supplementary measure that they think is sufficient to address a certain problem. This is not something you can read in a legal commentary. So that's why I think the work can be rather fast. The negotiation is hard to predict. That would be my take.
Okay, thanks, Johan. I'd just like to address one more question to our panel before bringing in some questions from the audience now. And this one's for you, Mikhail. So you mentioned this earlier, but Euroclear has put forward its European Cloud User Coalition. Can you tell us a bit more about this initiative and how codes of conduct can interact and potentially support the goals of this project?
Yes, I believe it could be perceived as a sister initiative towards our codes of conduct, because again, here we are focusing very much on the compliance aspect, on the privacy, on the data protection. While in the European Cloud User Coalition, we went a bit more technical into encryption, secure connectivity, right to audit. So all the nitty-gritty details and standards that are very much applicable for the regulated financial institutions. And I believe there's a value because that would facilitate the emergence of the global standards. Because I believe what we are trying to do with the code of conduct and with the white paper that we published last week as European Cloud User Coalition, it goes into the same direction. So we would like to actively shape the industry. So private sector, so the consumers of the cloud like ourselves, and the providers of the cloud technologies like the IBMs, the Microsofts, the Amazons of this world, I believe we could hand in hand agree on some common standards that would facilitate a proper lawmaking that would be then achievable and predictable from our perspective. So I see that as a complementary initiative. And again, we have some further ambitions to define, especially the security standards, to make sure, again, so our problem statement is to ensure towards our regulators and ultimately towards the customers, so the central securities depository to the custodian banks, that we shall be always in control in the cloud sphere. And I would even argue that by design or by nature, cloud is more resilient and secure. We just need to agree on the standards that would makes us possible to demonstrate that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks very much for your comments there, Mikhail. I'd like to bring in some of the questions from the audience now. We're getting them through thick and fast, so I hope that we get through as many as possible. This one is from Vincent Manacor at Politico Europe, and perhaps this is one for you, Jörn. Why did Scope Europe choose Belgium as a base when it originally had a German organization? Why not just stay in Germany?
Very good point. No, it was definitely not forum shopping as we found out later, David. That was not the point. No, I mean, this initiative, so Scope Europe was also designed to, as I said, to meet the requirements of Article 41. The EU Cloud CUC was the first initiative that we wanted to host. So that came from the European Commission. Now, it started in the European Commission and was given to the industry later. So this is kind of, it was already somehow in Brussels, was in the heart of Europe. And we also wanted, our understanding of codes of conduct is, and of the market in general, not only the cloud market, is that every company is now looking for a solution that is as broad as possible. So ideally Europe, but even more if possible. So we wanted to get rid of the view that we create solutions for only one member state, but for whole Europe. And I think there's no better place in Europe than do that in Brussels.
Okay, very clear response there, Jörn. We also have a question from Thomas Flambeau, who asks, what are the key differences between binding corporate rules and adhering to the cloud COC? Maybe this is one for you, David.
Binding corporate rules, I see. So what are binding corporate rules? Binding corporate rules are an instrument which you can use as a company to arrange transfers of data within a company or a group context. It's more, for me, an instrument oriented towards an individual company, a code of, and so we can approve and negotiate binding corporate rules as well. So it's more for an individual company. For me, a code of conduct is more sector oriented and more, how should I say, less, so not oriented towards one specific company, and has a more transversal or global approach on how you will deal with the GDPR. So essentially, I think the difference is binding corporate rules is for a company or a group of companies, one legal entity, let's say, or a group of entities, and more oriented is an instrument towards transfers within a group. Codes of conduct can deal with any kind of topic and is more sector oriented. I think that's the essential difference. So there are two different instruments which you can rely upon. Also in for the different provisions you need to comply with in GDPR.
Okay, thanks, David. We're getting a few nodding heads on our panel again, and I wonder if anyone would like to chime in on that point. Perhaps, Mikhail, you were nodding vigorously there.
No, I concur. I actually believe that's the trend. I don't know what to add. It was spot on. Yeah, so I just strongly agree.
Great. Okay, let's move on with a few more questions now. We have one from Jose Bello, who asks, if a member state supervisory authority has not adopted the code of conduct, does it still apply to that member state under Chapter 7 of the GDPR? Now, this is quite a strong question. I wonder if perhaps, David, you would like to address this one, or another member of our panel would be brave enough to take it?
I can give it a shot. Of course, we need to make a distinction between purely national codes of conduct, and there are several ones in Europe adopted by national authorities. We also adopted one in Belgium quite recently, which have a national scope, I would say. That doesn't mean that some data couldn't leave the Belgian territory, but in the end, there's a national code of conduct. Of course, we don't need to involve other authorities in adopting those. And then there's the transnational codes of conduct, which needs to pass. That's a part or a step in the approval process, which needs to pass and get an advice, hopefully unanimously, but there can be votes too, of course, of the European Data Protection Board, where we are united with all the European data protection authorities. That's why, so this is, and then afterwards, it's not the European Data Protection Board that approves the transnational code of conduct, but the national lead, what we call lead supervisory authority. So that's, yesterday, there was the advice of the EDPB, unanimously supporting this and the CISPE codes. Today, this morning, as I said, I signed the formal adoption decision and the accreditation decision of Scope Europe. I think that distinction needs to be made. So this any transnational code of conduct will need to pass the tests of the different 26, 27 European colleagues, and that's why this one is so exceptional. It's not just a Belgian code. No, all regulatory authorities formulated an advice yesterday that this was an appropriate code, and that's why it's such an achievement of the Belgian authority and team, of course.
Absolutely. And Sam, if I may jump in there, it's also originating in industry, because it was industry like Jonathan cloud providers that approached Jörn to create this because we as users have a need. And therefore, I feel that this code of conduct, having gone through the cohesion mechanism according to Article 63 of GDPR, is the first and historic monument to this cooperation between industry on the one hand side, but data protection supervisory authorities on the other hand side. I mean, you guys, David, you've been very busy promulgating all kinds of pieces of advice. I mean, working papers, I guess we're now into the 200s, 300s, something like that. But this is the first code that comes from industry. I mean, hello, there was the champagne bottles. This is outstanding. So thank you very much again for all your effort here.
Okay, thanks, Oliver, there for your comments. We've got another question here from the audience, and perhaps, Oliver, you can pick this one up, or Helmut. And it's about Gaia X, actually. And Alexander Doscher asks, how does the Cloud User Coalition aim to develop standards and align with Gaia X's technical standards?
Well, if I may go first, given that I'm working on the Policy Rules Committee, the PRC. First, Gaia, we have a central unit now. So I guess all official utterings go from there. So it's Francesco Bonfiglio you want to talk to. But let me add this. We're busy making this happen, and the technical standard will certainly reach out to data spaces such as the financial services sector. So there is already 14 national hubs. So there's plenty of opportunity to get involved. We're going to have the first General Assembly on Monday, June 7th. Where we'll firstly vote for the permanent board, but you can already get involved in various user groups, as Jonathan, I think you are. Michael, you want to add to that?
Sorry, I was on the mute. Yes, again, I believe we are converging. To be honest with you, it's still early stages. I believe there's a bit of positive buzz with all of us co-creating and sharing thought process. I believe the longer we go, the more we are going to converge and mature. So I actually see some pockets of expertise coming from the Cloud User Coalition, coming from Gaia X, when we need to synchronize even more. Because again, we are approaching that sometimes from a various angle. It's either the data view that we are focusing, so the privacy, the protection. It could be the compliance view, so demonstrating full adherence to the regulations. It could be the pure cyber view, so to make sure that we are resilient. It's all encrypted, we have rights to audit, we have data portability. So I believe different groups are approaching that from slightly different perspective, and there's a potential for us to converge more. So I'm actually looking forward for all these initiatives to set the scene and go to the similar direction. But I believe it's quite early on, so I don't have the full picture in mind yet. But again, it's an interesting market that is maturing. If I look like 5 years ago, half of these discussions were not even existing. And right now we are actually maturing that we are using cloud more and more while contributing to the industry standards creation and emergence.
Okay, thanks, Mikhail. Jonathan, you were nodding your head there. There's an opportunity for more convergence here between these different initiatives as part of the code.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the landscape slightly more widely, and the notion of zero trust is coming up. As to say, human trust is great, but in the end, when you're taking operational risk and you're outsourcing, deploying operations on the cloud, trusting your data with what are in effect third parties, you need the human trust chain, but you need verifiable trust through standards and requirements on top of that. And I think that's the new paradigm right across, data protection, information security, NIS2 directive, the executive order in the US that's just been published, that really demands higher verifiable, provable standards that are carefully monitored, because that supplements, human trust is great, but objects don't necessarily trust each other. So we need to get to this level of verifiable, provable compliance, which will drive this trust culture.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan. We are rapidly coming to the end of panel 1, I'm afraid, and I'm conscious that we only have a couple of minutes left. So perhaps I'd like to turn the conversation back to the panelists now for some very, very short closing remarks, 30 seconds or so, just to summarize your main points as part of our first panel discussion. And perhaps first we could turn to David Stevens, Chairman of the Belgian Data Protection Authority.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll try to be very short. People that know me know that I'm not so well in that. But let me say, okay, today we approved the first code of conduct for cloud services. Many more will come. I think we also will invest as Belgian Data Protection Authority, according to our strategic plan, in other instruments. I'm very eager to looking into the idea of sandboxing, which is another, but in a completely other sector. It's a complete other instrument, but the idea is that there is some kind of, I would almost call it co-creation of innovation between industry or public authorities and the regulator in this case for privacy. So that is the authority we want to be in the future. The code of conduct and all the effort we invested in this one is I believe a proof of what we want to do. There's much more to come, many more instruments. So stay tuned, I would say.
Thank you very much for joining us here today, David. Oliver Druff, Chief Privacy Officer at the Volkswagen Group.
I congratulate you that you've brought this through, David and Jan and everybody involved. I think that this EU Cloud Code of Europe is a comprehensive code that covers all levels of the delivery model in the cloud. We as customers enjoy great protection by this trust mark approach because we can choose what level of safety we want. As a big player, I clearly strive for the highest level of assurance, as Jan pointed out. And we particularly profit from the monitoring approach because with this independent monitoring body, we can sort of like reduce our monitoring efforts in this important technology. Thank you very much.
Here, Dr. Oliver Druff. Mikhail Paprosky, CTO at Euroclear, we'd like to hear your closing remarks, please.
So coming from technology angle and the private sector, I actually love the debate, so many thanks to all of you for having me here. I believe we are converging and maturing our cloud journey, which are very much welcome. And I love the concept of David, that the sandboxing, because I also see regulators themselves onboarding cloud. So sometimes we actually are maybe not partners in crime, but we share the same objectives or the same challenges. So I actually see great willingness and openness to cooperate on these emerging standards. That helps me tremendously. One of the items that I believe would be another game changer is portability. So making sure that we could stay cloud and vendor agnostic. So that's going to be the next layer of the game. So looking forward to participating in that.
Thank you very much, Mikhail, for joining us here this morning. I would now like to turn to Jonathan Sage, EU lead at IBM Government and Regulatory Affairs and chair of the EU Cloud COC General Assembly. Jonathan.
Yeah, Sam, thanks for the question. I think what I take away from this is this has been a very long journey, for some of us as long as 9 years. So the sense of when we finally got the news yesterday that we'd finally made it, and this was significant for us because we've invested a lot of time at a personal and professional level. That was what I take away from this, and recalling many meetings with Helmut, which I'm sure we'll reflect on in the future towards this goal.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan, for joining us here as part of our panel one discussion. It sounds like it's been almost somewhat of a 9-year sigh of relief that that we're all experiencing today. And finally, Johan Wittmann, Managing Director of Scope Europe. We'd like to hear your concluding remarks, please.
I would like to connect to what Jonathan said and what you just stated with the 9 years. My statement would be to everyone who wants to draft a code of conduct, don't get discouraged by this time frame. First of all, in these 9 years, it was already mentioned, a small thing happened called GDPR that made it necessary to perform certain changes of the work. But secondly, let's not forget, this was the first initiative. There needed to be procedures in the EDPB. Also, the EDPB needed to be familiar with the tool, as well as the industry needed to be familiar with the tool. The whole journey is worth it because you build a very strong understanding on all sides, on the DPA side, on the industry side, for each other's views on certain things. And already the way there led to a strong improvement of data protection, not only the result that is, of course, ultimately here, and then gives you also legal benefit. So my message is a positive one. I'm pretty sure that now with the lessons learned, it will be much easier for other players to come to the same result.
Thank you very much, Johan, for joining us here as part of our panel one discussion. And we have run out of time for the first round of talks, but we're not done completely for this morning yet because we're going to take a 3-minute break before coming back for panel 2 with a renewed sense of vigour and energy. And as part of our discussion after the break, we'll be exploring how the adoption process of the EU Cloud COC has concretely impacted cloud service providers and their day-to-day activities. And we'll also seek to probe the monitoring concept behind the code too. So stay with us for now. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.